As he rose to present his budget in the House of Commons on November 22, Philip Hammond was in a very tight spot. Neither the economy nor the public finances are in great shape, even before factoring in Brexit. At the same time, Britons are increasingly fed up with stagnating living standards and squeezes on public spending. The need to square that circle made the Chancellor's task a tricky one. Despite this, Mr. Hammond struck an optimistic tone, arguing that the Conservatives were up to the job of making Britain fit for the future. He delivered a cautious budget that is unlikely to give his enemies in the Tory party an excuse to call for him to go. But his lack of fiscal and political room for maneuver meant that he was unable to do much more than that. Upgrade your inbox, receive our daily dispatch and editor's picks newsletters. Mr. Hammond first had to deal with significantly poorer economic forecasts from the Office for Budget Responsibility (OBR), the fiscal WOTCOGC chart. For that, blame a big downgrade in expected productivity growth, i.e., what the average worker produces per hour. The OBR's growth forecasts, though grim, may still be too rosy. They assume that long after Brexit, annual net migration to Britain will exceed 160,000, which runs up against the government's daft promise to reduce it to the tens of thousands. Nor do they take into account a disorderly no-deal Brexit, which could yet happen. Weak productivity growth is bad news for Britain's pay, which is still below the peak it reached before the financial crisis of 200,809. The OBR revised down its forecast for earnings growth. That has a knock-on effect on the national living wage, the floor set for the over 25s. In March last year, the assumption was that by 2020 it would be worth £9.12 an hour. Now the OBR thinks it will be worth nearly 50 pence less than that. Mr. Hammond tried to distract from the awful economic news with a battery of jokes that were almost as bad in one. Theresa May theatrically produced a packet of cough sweets, in a reference to her disastrous speech to the Tory conference earlier this year. Yet he also had a serious message, that getting productivity and wages up is the central mission of the Treasury. The trouble is that weak productivity growth in itself reduces tax revenues, and hence the amount of cash Mr. Hammond has to achieve that objective. The OBR has increased its forecast of how much the Chancellor will need to borrow. And with Brexit looming, he is keen to show the financial markets that he will meet his self-imposed fiscal targets, one of which requires him to limit the structural budget deficit to 2% of GDP by 2021. With all this in mind, and with the Conservatives' working majority slight, it was no surprise that the solutions he proposed were as unobjectionable as they were weak. He made much of upgrading skills, and rightly so. A big reason for Britain's weak productivity growth is the breakdown of the diffusion of technological innovation from its most go-getting firms to its middling ones. Proposals to improve workers' tech literacy aim to fix that problem. Mr. Hammond pledged money for maths and computer science teachers. A national retraining scheme will help older workers who struggle with new gadgets. But despite all this, real terms spending on employment policies, science, technology and education remains some 15% lower than in 2010. The centerpiece of the budget, however, was housing. A malfunctioning housing market can constrain productivity growth by making it hard for people to work where they are most productive. Conservatives like to encourage home ownership for political reasons, too, since they believe it breeds Tory voters. Radicals in the cabinet advocate a repeal of stamp duty, a tax on home buyers, which discourages moving and more building on the greenbelt, tracts of land protected from development in order to constrain urban sprawl. Given the poor fiscal outlook, Mr. Hammond may have felt that repealing stamp duty was out of the question. Mrs. May, meanwhile, is no fan of loosening the greenbelt. The Prime Minister's leafy constituency, Maidenhead, is in a part of the country that is girdled by greenbelt land. Mr. Hammond thus plumped for a number of modest proposals, adding to the 200 or so housing visas that the government has put forward since 2010. One was to abolish stamp duty for first-time buyers purchasing a house worth £300,000 or less, with discounts for those buying houses at up to £500,000. The policy will end up costing over £500 million a year, but the hope is that young folk will find it easier to clamber onto the housing ladder. Mr. Hammond said it would revive the home-owning dream. Yet at least part of the tax cut will be cancelled out, as buyers bid up house prices using the money that the Chancellor has saved them. The OBR expects average house prices to rise by about 3% a year anyway. The policy will have no impact on housing supply, which most economists see as the fundamental problem. Mr. Hammond hopes councils will do the heavy lifting. Allowing them to levy higher taxes on empty dwellings may help bring more houses onto the market. Certain councils will soon be exempted from limits on how much they can borrow, which will allow them to boost spending on construction. Nonetheless, forecasts imply that annual house building is unlikely to hit the government's target of 300,000. Given the circumstances, Mr. Hammond played his hand as best he could. Yet it would be naive to believe that the latest proposals will do much to right the problems that afflict Britain's economy. Future budgets will be trickier still.